Welcome to The Academic Issue, your go-to podcast on Canadian academia. We are University Affairs, Canada's premier publication dedicated to higher education. For over 60 years, we've been at the heart of the nation's university community, providing news, commentary, and advice to those working in the hallowed halls across the country. Whether you're a seasoned professor, a curious grad student, or just intrigued by the inner workings of university life, we've got you covered. I'm Kate Kenyon, digital content creator for University Affairs, and I'm looking at the forces shaping higher education today and what they mean for you. So join me as I explore life through the academic lens. This is The Academic Issue. The pandemic and the associated student mental health crisis brought the plight of students to the forefront of public consciousness. But what seems to have gone less examined is the impact on professors and faculty, who are often on the receiving end of student anxiety and called upon to provide support. What duty of pastoral care do faculty have for their students? Are some academics bearing more of the burden of student support than others? And what, more broadly, should faculty do to safeguard their well-being against the manifold pressures of the academic life? Professor Kim Hellemans is the Associate Dean of Science at Carleton University and is responsible for student recruitment, wellness, and success. I spoke with Kim on the Carleton campus to find out more about mental health in academia. Kim Hellemans, hello.
Hello.
How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm thrilled to be here. We're here in this lovely studio space at Carleton that you and your team have so generously allowed us to record in today. So I get to meet you on your home campus and speak to you in person, which is fantastic. So thank you so much.
Thank you for coming to Carleton.
And now, do I call you Professor Hellemans?
Oh, Kim is fine.
Okay, great. Yep. Perfect. Well, shall we start then on that note with you introducing yourself to our listeners and maybe giving them a sense of your role here at Carleton?
Sure. So my name is Kim Hellemans. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Neuroscience here at Carleton University. I'm also an associate dean of science. And my role here is I'm the associate dean of student recruitment, wellness, and success. So my role is to get students to come join our amazing faculty of science and take programs here. And then when they're here, I take care of them and make sure that they feel like they can be successful.
Right. And it's that latter side of your role that I'm really interested in exploring today. You have an academic component as a professor of neuroscience, but you're also in a sort of more pastoral, should we say, student-facing role where you have a caretaking element to what you do. Now, you mentioned it's student-facing. Everyone's familiar with the so-called student mental health crisis of recent years, particularly worsened by the pandemic. Have you seen an uptick anecdotally in your work in issues to do with mental health that students have presented with?
For sure. And I should mention as well that my research program also, what I look at is emerging adult mental health, of which university students fall into that category. So I do see the impact of the pandemic, both on my academic research side as well as my administrative side. So we actually have been collecting data looking at student mental health since even before the pandemic. We have research looking at student mental health during the pandemic, and now we're continuing to explore that in the context of students' academic resilience post-pandemic, but also recognizing that the students' needs have changed drastically since the pandemic and how that's playing out in the classrooms, the impact on how they're meeting or not meeting, I should say, academic deadlines, the fact that we're seeing an increase in stress levels, decreased distress tolerance, and then, of course, how that's impacting our professoriate, because ultimately this is having an echo effect of having to have our professors respond to these changing needs. So yes, for sure, we're seeing it academically, and the research is also showing that as well.
Yeah, that is fascinating. And that's exactly what I want to try and focus on today. I think there's plenty out there about what students have gone through and are going through. But I thought it might be interesting to turn the lens on the professoriate, as you say, and how this actually impacts them. Zooming out a little bit, speaking generally, how do you think professors are doing right now in Canada in terms of their mental health?
Well, I would say, like everybody, I think we've seen a wonderful uptick in our ability to recognize ill mental health, to talk about it. We've had a lot of campaigns to destigmatize mental health. And what that's meant is there is a lot more awareness around recognizing when somebody isn't doing well. So that is something that we can acknowledge has been happening across all demographics. And we've recognized that, undergraduate students have been suffering. There's been sort of a mental health crisis among our young adults. And I would say now it's kind of trickling upwards. And I think what we're seeing is changing demographics, right? So we're seeing, the professoriate that's joining our ranks now are, they're the millennials as well as the Gen X's. So more of that willingness to acknowledge when I'm not doing well, but then also the impact of the pandemic. For some folks, it increased mental health symptoms and concerns from an already vulnerable population. We saw, more young adults and adults drinking, for example, consuming cannabis products. So coping perhaps problematically with the stress of the pandemic, loneliness, isolation, all those factors which we know impacted youth, kids and young adults. But of course, it impacted all generations to varying degrees. So I would say there's definitely, I'm seeing a more of awareness around ill mental health among professoriate, but yet what isn't following is also less stigma. I think the stigma is still very prevalent, and the willingness to accept and ask for support, I say, is still quite low. Universities right now, the funding situation is really challenging. And so across Ontario, for sure, we're seeing less funding of universities, which is definitely affecting our professoriate, recognizing there's budget cuts. We have to live in a very lean budget right now, which is worrisome, particularly as it relates to individuals' research programs, supporting graduate students. So there's all these numerous factors that are playing a role in impacting professors' mental health.
Hi, this is Dan Halton, editor of University Affairs. I hope you're enjoying our podcast. The academic issue is just one of many exciting changes here at UA. Our mission is to keep you informed and connected to the people, events, and ideas that are shaping Canadian universities. We also provide access to comprehensive career advice and the largest source of academic job postings. Visit our website to subscribe. There's a lot happening at Canada's universities. University Affairs has it covered.
From the research I've done and the people I've spoke to, you've really hit the nail on the head there, as far as I understand it, in terms of this is a structural part of the job. A lot of it seems to be based in a lack of funding that has a trickle-down effect on the nature of being a professor today. I want to read you something from Psychology Today, November 2023. Dr. Anna Katharina Schaffner, former professor at the University of Kent in the UK, where I'm from, notably no longer an academic. She left it and became a burnout coach. And in her article, she says the following. I'm going to read it to you and ask you if you recognize this as a characterization of the professor job today. She says, most of us originally entered academia to do two things, to teach and to conduct research. Ironically, we now spend ever less time on either of these tasks. We are now expected not just to publish world-class research and be 5-star rated teachers, but regularly to attract external funding, take on leadership roles, support students with ever more complex needs, act as marketers for our programs, and ensure that our research generates measurable impact in the real world. In addition, we have to stay on top of hundreds of emails each week, attend endless efficiency enhancement meetings, and negotiate often toxic politics. We are also encouraged to see each other as competition for prestige, power, funding, promotions, students, influence, and jobs. Do you recognize that as that long list of challenges?
Yikes. Yes. Yeah. I think that, as you said, it encapsulates the fact that our roles have become broader. And I think that's the nature of the pressures on the academy in a 21st century environment where the funding is ever decreasing in various pockets. And we're an ever complex institution with more complex needs. And, as was quoted in that article, the role of just coming in and doing your research and teaching a class or two, that is long gone, right?
I think that's still a perception outside of academia, that being a professor is something of a more easygoing and relaxed way of life, not like the 9-to-5 corporate existence, yes. Easier hours, less of a workload. You get to spend a lot of time reading and researching, when actually I don't get the impression that's the case anymore, if it ever was the case.
I would say simple. It would have had more simple demands rather than easy, because it's simple in the sense that doing research is what we were trained to do, right? And we feel very competent when it comes to engaging in some of us feel competent in the work of doing research, right? Ironically, teaching is not what we were trained to do, and yet we do it anyway. And it's a big part of our job, depending on the institution that we're in. What we aren't trained to do is project management, leadership, budget planning, all those other elements that, was mentioned in that quote of the article that are a necessity of being a successful academic in 2024 and beyond. And I think there's that gap of the training to the expectation to the reality of being a professor that is probably really, I would say it's a challenge. You're coming into a job that you're meant to manage massive research teams at the same time as understand various online processes to do your ordering for your lab and also, do the checks and balances to make sure all your travel can get recompensated and so on and so forth. So there's all these minutiae of administrative tasks that are necessary to exist. And I would say it's becoming a bigger part of our day-to-day existence as opposed to what I would imagine is the academic of the 1950s, where you were able to come in and you had a secretary, right?
Yeah.
To do a lot of that work for you. And then you had a teaching assistant. This is what's on the movies, right? You have the TA that comes in and teaches the class for you, which is like hilarious. Yeah. But you do all that. That's our jobs are incredibly complex, not like other jobs aren't. But I think it is the fact that we haven't been trained in a lot of that is leading to a lot of challenge. And incidentally, I have created on a team grant to create some of that curriculum for graduate students to be able to learn how to do that project management, difficult conversations, mentorship, all those things, because we recognize it's what's necessary. And that a lot of folks that are coming into these jobs, particularly from equity-owed groups, are at a greater disadvantage than folks that are coming from more privileged positions.
Right. And also, I think I saw from my research that it's sometimes those groups, for example, women and racialized women, who bear the burden of academic housework, emotional labor. They do a lot of the caretaking and people approach them more. Do you see that anecdotally?
100%. Yep. I think there are, particularly when it comes to that pastoral role that you were indicating earlier, that for the most part, it is very gendered. Students expect women to be more compassionate and more, if they've got a challenge, to listen. So they tend to come to women professors more often than not, and particularly racialized, especially as we have most of our campuses are very diverse. We have lots of awesome students from lots of different pockets of life. And so folks that identify as a member of an underrepresented group are more likely to approach a professor that's also from a member of an underrepresented group because they get a sense of kinship. And that's why it's really important to have representation in our professoriate. But then those folks tend to bear the emotional and cognitive labor of engaging in that pastoral work, as you were saying.
Yeah, I want to come to maybe advice you might offer for that sort of issue. But firstly, I know you're mostly student-facing, but in your role at Carleton, in our initial talk, I remember you describing your role as something of a node. Do lots of people, including professors from across the ecosystem of Carleton, come to you to speak to you about these issues? So are you getting anecdotal stories from professors about the challenges they're facing? And I suppose, what are the principal things that people come to you to talk about? For
sure. And it's true. I like to consider that I am a very public face to the institution. It's something that I do feel it's important to advertise, that on campus, it's important to have conversations about mental health and substance use health. It's important to reduce the stigma around that. I am not a counselor. I have no training in therapy, but I know the systems and structures really well here, and I know who to go to for support. And so I'd like to, publicize that if you're ever not sure, please do come to me. I'm happy to have those conversations with you. And so for sure it's for the students, but what I've been finding is that I'm getting people coming in, like often it's like a whispered conversation. It's pulled aside at another event on campus. It's a private message in my inbox from faculty members that, I don't know how to support the students, for example. And we have 5 faculties at Carleton. I'm in the Faculty of Science, but I have people coming from all different parts of the organization. I don't know how to support a student, or I'm feeling overwhelmed by how much support I'm giving. And I'm like, whoa, put the brakes, right? We have to have boundaries with students. But then also seeking supports from themselves, or even sometimes their partners or their loved ones, that it is something that I am increasingly seeing as people reaching out and saying, I'm not well. Where do I go? Or I'm drinking too much. where do I go for help? Or my partner's drinking too much. And so I think it's awesome that people are feeling that comfort, and yet there's still that layer of don't tell anybody else, right? I hear that a lot. It's the stigma and shame of needing support is still quite prevalent in the academy.
That strikes me as strange because, as you said, cultural attitudes towards mental health discussions have changed in recent years, particularly during the pandemic. I am surprised that in somewhere like a university setting, there would be a continuing stigmatization and shame surrounding mental health. Do you think that is more common among professors than among students?
Oh, yes.
Why is that?
Yes.
What's going on there?
I would say any role where we are measured on that standard of competence, academics are still like running their own island. There's a lot of responsibility on our shoulders, particularly if we run research labs and run teams. And it's still a male-dominated space where I think there's still a lot of toxic masculinity that dominates, that it's not okay to seek help and seek support because I should be able to tough it out and do it on my own. And, we were mentored by those people who were mentored by those people and so on and so forth. So there's still sort of this place of silence around that it's not okay to not be okay. And worries and fears about how that affects our promotion and our tenure, because we are continually being evaluated to have job stability, right? And imagine if you're in a precarious labor position, right? You're a contract instructor or you're a postdoc or a graduate student that's teaching for the institution, for example, and are not doing well. I think there's still a lot of fear that you will be judged harshly for not doing okay. And there's still a lot of sentiment that what I would say is sort of that Victorian belief about mental health, that if you're not doing well, it's because you're weak of character, weak natured, which is appalling in 2024.
Yeah, one of our authors at University Affairs, Megan Auer, she's a PhD candidate at the University of Alberta, and she wrote a piece entitled How to Navigate the Cruelty of Supervisory Care. So she was speaking about this from a graduate student perspective. And in a quotation that begins the article, she talks about an interaction with a supervisor in which she was told, "I'm just trying to toughen you up. In academia, you need to be tough to do well." And it does strike me that is that very, as you say, draconian Victorian view that this is just the nature of it. Academics have to be tough. We're in that category of job. Either get tough or fail. That does seem to be prevalent.
Well, and that's what comes out in our classrooms too. I always say there's this belief that you can't be compassionate with your students because it decreases the rigor of your course.
Your leadership and yeah.
And I'm here to say, you can be a compassionate, flexible instructor and still have a rigorous course and hold students up to a high standard. And those two things can intersect. And you can have it for yourself as well, that to struggle is to be human, and that it's okay to struggle, but to also still, you can do a great job of your work, especially if you rest, right? So that's the mentality I have with my research team. Is my graduate students sometimes say, I'm not doing well, I need to step away. Great. You step away, take care of yourself, because I know that when you come back, you're going to be working harder and at a better capacity than if you're trying to burn out working when you're not feeling completely awesome. So it's that sort of towing that line of, we're not always 100%, but knowing that it's okay to step away when you're feeling really unwell, as opposed to just working when you're feeling awesome. You know what I mean? It's that really difficult line to toe, and I don't think we've got it yet.
It must be so hard to put aside your sense that you will fall behind and you won't be competitive if you're not going at it 100% of the time, because you've described a very competitive job market, working environment in which everyone is competing for ever scarcer positions, huge amount of pressure to publish, huge amount of pressure to bring in funding, a lot of loneliness, all these pressures. You can see why somebody would feel they cannot take a break, they cannot rest.
For sure. And more likely women and people from equity-owed groups, right? Because structurally, they've also experienced a lot of that mentality that they can't do it, right? Like that's the oppressive systems that they've lived in. Society has told them that this is not a place for you. And so we see this dominating existence of the publisher perish struggle, or, get out. Like I'm seeing a shift. Like it's definitely shifted since I started my graduate training in the late 90s. But we're not quite there yet, at a place where I think we figured out how to still acknowledge difficulty and to build, I would say, inner resilience, and to recognize when do we be resilient and when do we step away because we're really, you know what I mean? Not well. And I don't think we found that. I don't think medicine has found it, law, like any of those structures and hierarchies where it has been a place where only the truly tough will survive, right? It's survivorship bias.
Yeah, it's so much more brutal than the ivory towered image that academia sometimes has. I want to drill down into one aspect of the challenges professors face, which to me is one of the most interesting, and that is the supporting role for their students. Professors are called upon to provide all kinds of support, not just academic, but increasingly emotional, to their students and to different kinds of student, right? An undergraduate at 20 or 21 years old faces a completely different set of challenges and concerns. They are at a completely different life stage to a PhD who is thinking more about their career, a completely different set of concerns, may have children. You know, these are wildly different life experiences, but these are the people that are all reporting into a professor figure who has to support them. Do professors talk to you about this? And what are some of the most challenging aspects of having to provide that support role to a diverse group of people who are under your care, as it were?
For sure. And I would say with the undergraduates, as you said, you've hit on it, that it's some profs get seen as that very supportive pastoral human. So, some will come visit during office hours and ask for support. And I'm always very clear that the best way to be with the undergrads is to be that compassionate, vulnerable, authentic human. You can be that way, right? You're not sharing your woes and tales. That's too much. But to still be relational with them, relate to them on a humanity level, that they know they can come to you if they are not doing well, but it's I'm not doing well. And then you say, okay, here's what we need to do. We need to report up and out. And here are the places at an institution that you can seek help and support, right? But I would say it's not incumbent upon the professor to be a therapist. If a student is starting to tell you their life story, it's too much. Right? You can hear a little bit and say, okay, I hear you're not well. Here's where we should go. And it's navigating that, which takes skill, right? To be open enough to be there that the student recognizes that you're a support system, but also have that boundary, right? And that I would say is training and important, not to get overburdened by the quantity and nature of those conversations. So I say the undergraduates, that's what I hear the burden sometimes of professors who are 2 hours of office hours with students who are coming, as an example. You got to give it to the people who are trained to manage wellness. And then with graduate students, I'm hearing increasingly the challenge of graduate students because the system is not well designed for graduate training and wellness. It really isn't. You can't take breaks without losing your funding.
Wow.
Yes. So imagine this now. You've got an older adult, right? Or young, they're 24 to 29, 30 plus, depending on where they're at in their training. Maybe they've got families. Maybe they're also taking care of parents, right? They're caregivers themselves. They're also trying to pay rent in a really difficult economy. Most of them are working part-time because they have to. And then the graduate training is so structured that it's not like you can step away from a course in the same way that undergraduates can. You can't necessarily pause your degree in the same way, right? Undergraduates are still kind of living with mom and dad or mom and dad or whatever. They're still considered dependent, whereas graduate students, less so. They're more out on their own. And you pause a semester, you lose your research, you lose a whole course that then is very difficult to keep progressing in. So the very nature of graduate training is such that taking a step away is really, really hard. And so sometimes you kind of have to work around the system. I think if anything, this is where our attention needs to focus on now. We've done so well with undergraduate student mental health. We have a lot of resources and supports for them. I feel like graduate students and postdocs are forgotten about. They're this major gap in our circle of care on our campuses that I think increasingly we're seeing sort of that attitude of struggle or, the struggle is part of the training. And so there's more of that in that space.
It does sound like they are struggling more than most of the other groups in the university setting. I know that's complex, but can you just reiterate for me, what are the principal problems happening there that's causing such pressures on graduate students?
I would say they're a generation where, again, the mental health awareness piece is great and it's big and they're aware and they're talking about it. They also are a complex generation with social media. They're the digital age. Just gave a lecture on social media addiction. So they're feeling the pressure of an increasingly digital society where they're present, the challenges of an economy that it's very difficult to afford to live and to eat. We're seeing increasingly food insecurity among our graduate students. They have to hold part-time employment, which means that it's difficult to then, imagine you're doing graduate training and you're also working 20 plus hours a week. Really, really hard. And then at a time where the funding really hasn't kept up with the cost of living. So that's why they're working part-time. And then existing, I would say, in that moment in time where I think the university and the professoriate are at an inflection point of recognizing, okay, graduate students are struggling, but there's nothing they can do because of the nature of the program, that it's very hard for them to step away without being penalized financially and career-wise. We're at a time where it's an urgent time, I would say, to reinvent an equitable programmatic process for graduate students where it is recognized that they can step away and they are not penalized.
Big structural change needed there. And it's just one of the reasons why mental health is so key in academia, isn't it? Because what you're describing there is an untenable situation for lots of people who had intended to become our next generation of academics, our next generation of professors, but who potentially won't because the situation is not feasible. So we all miss out on having a strong generation of future professors because it's on a personal level too challenging to be one.
That's right. And the data are clear that society's problems are best solved by a diverse future problem solvers, right? So the necessity of graduating our next generation of thought leaders in academia who can do the work and are diverse. And that's really important. And if we're continuing to lose folks from underrepresented groups, that's on us, right? That's on us to make sure that that doesn't happen. And that's why all the more reason that we need better funding for graduate students. We need better support for them, recognizing that the ones that are going to have the survivorship of this are going to be individuals that come from privileged class, race, gender, ethnicity, and so on.
Do you think that students' expectations of their professors have shifted in recent years back to the supporting role? Do students expect support and perhaps greater accommodations for mental health complaints from professors? Is that something that you see professors reporting?
Yeah, undergraduates for sure. And creeping up with the graduate students, that's what we're seeing. And it was predicted, a sort of tsunami of academic accommodation needs that have. So during the pandemic, we had to accommodate the students. We had to do what we could to get them through a degree in a very challenging environment. And what that did was sort of remove a lot of the stressors that they normally would have been facing. And arguably what's now happening is that we've got a generation of students that are coming in that haven't had the same degree, the quantity and the quality of the stressors, and so are unable to now return to normal, where previous generations, you could handle 3 midterms in a week. Now it's like, well, I have 3 midterms, so they put in an accommodation request to have their 3rd midterm deferred because they can't possibly write 3 midterms in 1 week. So it is very much the case that we're seeing this coupled with rising formal accommodation needs for mental health concerns. And ADHD is now the top accommodation need, at least at Carleton, that we're seeing. So for sure, we are encountering generations of students that need more support, need deadline extensions, need to manage their time differently than previous generations. And that, of course, is being downloaded to some extent on the professors as well.
More strain on the professor.
That's right. That have to then manage these requests, right? And then it's a challenging push and pull scenario where, like I said, I feel like we haven't yet found that golden line of challenging the students. You know, it's like Goldilocks and 3 bears, like just right. Like, how do we challenge them just right where they're still, we're pushing them to be a little uncomfortable, but not so much so that we keep pushing them when they're really not well. And to find that it's also individual. Every student has a different push point, right? Where it's really uncomfortable. So it's tricky.
Do you think professors feel empowered and safe to make those calls, to push back on students, to draw that difficult Goldilocks line? Sometimes you hear about a shifting power dynamic between professors and students these days. Students with a sort of customer mindset, they're paying a lot for this academic study, they expect results, and they feel quite empowered to make requests. How do you think professors feel on the other side of that equation? Do they feel empowered, or do you think they feel a little cautious?
What I generally see, particularly in my role as associate dean, is two extremes, right? Is the professors who are giving students, they're like, yeah, wide open, anything you need, right? Because they think that's being kind. You can hand in anything, anytime, right? And I would say, don't do that. That's very bad, particularly for students who have executive dysfunction, right? Like ADHD. That's actually not scaffolding them appropriately. To the other end of the extreme, which is not allowing for any illness or stumbling along the way, right? So when I hear from students and professors that are disgruntled, it's those two extremes. And oddly, with the latter group of they're often quite rigid, and they see that as an equity issue. They say to me, well, why would I give this student this extra accommodation when all the other students don't get that accommodation need as well? So it's this, what I would say as a professor, you have to be like the bamboo. Sometimes you have to know when to bend with the wind, and sometimes you have to stay firm. And like you said, you asked, are they empowered? I think some of them are really struggling to know where to be, right? Because sometimes you do have to bend. Sometimes you have to stay firm, right? And it's really difficult.
And as you've indicated, that's not really part of the training.
No.
No one ever instructs you on this.
No.
It's very nuanced. It's not really part of what most people think of as being a professor when they're an undergrad, at least.
Yeah.
How do you train someone to draw that line,
It's knowing also, young adult, what's neurodevelopmentally normal, what builds good learning practices, what's good for mental health. Because I think a lot of folks also think stressing them too much is going to be bad for their mental health, right? And it's like these two extremes that, like I said, it's like the Goldilocks line. And I think what's missing is a lot of folks coming into these institutions not really knowing who they're working with.
Don't know their students.
That's right. Yeah.
I think it can be easy to project who you were when you were an undergraduate onto your undergraduate students when actually times have changed, and then really not necessarily like you were.
And I think also there wasn't as much of a need really to know your students. I don't know. I think that...
So you think that's been a shift, that the nature of the relationship between professor and student is different now than to, say, 15, 20 years ago?
Yes. And I think that that's been a change for good.
Yeah.
I like to believe that the conversations and the interactions I have with my students are an opportunity to connect with them. And that connection is what leads to amazing learning and mentorship. I think that that's where the magic happens, rather than coming in and talking down at them. Here's all this amazing knowledge that I have. Right?
Now leave. Yeah.
Go do with it what you will. I think that model of learning is gone. I think we need to acknowledge a shift in the classroom where it's a conversation. Like, I like to think that students have something to offer when they're in the classroom with me, and that I'm learning from them too, right? We're all experts and novices at the same time, with various elements of who they are and who I am. It's a place of self-discovery as well. And I think there's an openness to recognizing that. But I think it's like every cultural shift, it's uncomfortable right now.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier you're in a science department, but you speak to people from across the university. Out of interest, do you think there's a notable difference in how these issues around mental health play out among the scientists as opposed to the humanities disciplines? Are there any trends that you've noticed?
For sure. And I would say, so in science, even within science, there's different cultural pockets, right? So my physicists and my computer scientists and my mathematicians and statisticians have very different cultures than the biologists and the neuroscientists. Even then there's different approaches and attitudes. ran a study looking at engineering student mental health. Very different among the engineers. I can tell you that sort of struggle is, this is the nature of engineering. It's to struggle, is very common there. But that's also, you're seeing gendered differences. And I would also like to acknowledge neurodiversity differences, right? So you see in a lot of these disciplines, like math and engineering, there's a lot of folks that are autistic there. And I would say the need to be relational with a student when you are autistic is really challenging. And so I would say part of what we also need to acknowledge in the institution is our neurodiverse differences. And sometimes that's the education that I do. A professor's not being mean to you if they're writing a 3-word response to your email. That just may be the way that they relate. That's the way that they communicate. And so I think there's also a need of education around that, as well as like recognizing different forms of communication, different communication styles, particularly when we see in the sciences and engineering folks that tend to be more neurodiverse.
Hi there, listener. Kate Kenyon here. Did you know that universityaffairs.ca hosts one of the largest academic job portals in Canada? Whether you're a seasoned executive, a faculty member, or just getting started, there are so many interesting jobs available right now. Visit our website, universityaffairs.ca, to view our current listings and sign up for free career alerts. Let us deliver your next career opportunity right into your inbox. I wanted to pick up under the gendered aspect of strain that professors feel. We've spoken about that, but I wonder, when that presents itself to you here at Carleton, and you see that the burden is greater on a woman, say, what can be done about something like that is quite entrenched in the department?
I would say we need to recognize that work in tenure and promotion. That's the shift that needs to happen. If people are doing this work, it needs to be recognized and valued.
Yeah, because at the moment it's completely unpaid and not acknowledged, right? And it doesn't therefore further your career as an academic.
Where do I write on my tenure and promotion files that I have spent over 100 hours in pastoral work with my students? And I don't say this like this was before my associate dean role. I was doing it a lot. I was even saying to these young humans here, I have like 3 requests in my inbox to talk to students about their careers, right? Nobody does that outside of me and my department.
And that impact you're having is not measured by the institution.
No. Like, think about the impact. I would like to say that I truly believe there are some students in careers in postgraduate education directly because of the conversations that I've had with them.
I can 100% believe that. Yeah. I mean, that's been my experience. That is one of the most high value aspects of studying, in my view. It's that advice and guidance. What happens after I complete these studies?
Yeah. And then I see you as a human. I see you as what are your individual values? Where do you want to live? Where do you see yourself? Do you want to be near your family? I ask all these questions. I get to know my students because that work is important in guiding them into their degree and their next steps. And the students recognize that and they feel seen. And that's really important nowadays because they're entering our walls at younger ages, neurodevelopmentally quite young because of that massive gap that they had during COVID. It was like a giant cognitive delay. So I say to my faculty, these students that are entering our walls, they're like 15.
Wow.
They might be 18 chronologically, but they're akin to a 15-year-old.
It's that big a lag.
Yeah.
Wow. No wonder you're seeing additional requests for accommodations and struggles and perhaps less resilience than in previous populations. Yeah.
Yeah.
All of this it causes a burden that is borne by the professor who's providing this additional help and guidance and care. And you mentioned in our initial chat that a profession like a psychologist can take the burden on of their patients, of the people that they serve, and at the end of the day, go and speak to their supervisor and offload the burden, as it were. They can go home without so much of a weight on their shoulders. Not so for professors. There's no equivalent role there, is there?
No, there is not. But I would say that's why it's important to have social support. And that, as a stress researcher, is one of the best ways that you can buffer against the impact of some of these difficult situations. While we don't have clinical supervisors, what I would encourage all faculty is to recognize, first of all, again, the emotional cognitive burden of this, But who are the people around you that you can have that conversation with? Sometimes it's your departmental chair. Sometimes it's somebody like me, one of the associate deans or the dean. Who is somebody on campus? Like, I've got lots of amazing faculty members across campus that I can text on a moment's notice. I can ask to grab a coffee, and we can have, like, every 4 months with my psychology prof friends, we call it our wine and wine. And we have those moments with each other where we share what's happening in our lives with regard to our academic roles. And that is what is the evidence that shows it relieves the burden somewhat. And while women tend to take on more of those spaces of taking on the emotional burden, we're also slightly better at seeking out social support. So there's a bit of a balance there. Whereas I would say men may take on some of this burden, but then they're less likely to have a conversation with somebody about it, right? So they kind of hold it in.
So perhaps they experience more loneliness. That's typical of academia.
Yes. Yes. I haven't measured it. I would bet your hypothesis is right, that we see higher levels of loneliness among men.
Yeah. And what else do you do to take care of your mental health? You've mentioned their social support networks, but what do you do to make sure that you stay as the node taking on the burden of lots of people's different challenges? What do you do to take care of yourself?
Well, I do talk the talk, I would say, and walk the walk. So we know that the things that are within our control that support our own mental health and well-being, social support, regular exercise, good amount of sleep, and a diet that's fairly, healthy, clean. I exercise. I love to run. So I run commute to work. And I also am very religious about my sleep habits. So, those are the things that are within my control. I know that they affect my brain, and my brain is the organ of my mind. And it's really important for me to take care of myself, because if I don't take care of myself, I'm no good to anybody here. And then the same thing has to happen when I get home at the end of the day. And I have to be a compassionate, caring, listening, vulnerable human to my children, right? So that's something that I've learned as well through mistakes, is if I give everything of myself throughout the day when I'm at work, I got nothing left in the bank for my children when I get home. What I say is I don't balance my time so much as I balance my energy. What am I doing on a given day that expends that energy? And, again, this is through deep work that I've done. I've done coaching. I've had lots of crucial conversations with folks, difficult conversations with my spouse about recognizing if I'm spending an entire day doing career counseling with my students, leading XYZ, I'm spent by the end of the day. So I have to make sure that those moments are scattered throughout the week. Otherwise, I'm no good.
Kim Hellemans, thank you so much for speaking with me today about mental health in the university setting. What a privilege to speak with you. I've learnt a huge amount. Keep going with the running.
Awesome.
I'll keep going with my gym sessions and my yoga.
Excellent. Thank you for having me on the show.
Thank you for joining us on The Academic Issue.
You've been listening to The Academic Issue, a podcast by University Affairs. To read more on the topic of mental health and academia, take a look at our recommended reading list in the show notes. You'll also find links there to the sources cited in this episode. Stay on top of higher education news, opinion, and career advice by visiting universityaffairs.ca and sign up for our newsletter to receive weekly summaries of the big stories in Canadian academia. And don't forget to subscribe to The Academic Issue and leave us a review. We'd love to hear your feedback. You can also follow us on Instagram and X. Links can be found in the show notes. The Academic Issue is produced by Kate Kenyon with audio production by FEL Creative. Thank you so much for listening, and see you next time on The Academic Issue.